Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 1305th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Candice Hopkins and Jami Powell. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Candice Hopkins explores the intersections of history, contemporary art, and indigeneity in her writing and curatorial practice. She is executive director and chief curator of Forge Project and fellow in Indigenous art history and curatorial studies at Bard College. She curated Indian theater, performance, art, and self-determination at the Hessel Museum of Art with Raven Chacon. Impossible music for the Miller ICA and Tufts University Art Galleries. She was part of the curatorial team of the Canadian Pavilion of the 58th Venice Biennale, the SITE Santa Fe Biennial, and documenta 14 Athens and Kassel. And our host today, Jami Powell, is the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Indigenous Art at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, where she also serves as a senior lecturer in the Native American and Indigenous Studies Department. Powell has curated exhibitions including Form and Relation, Contemporary Native American Ceramics, This Land, American Engagement with the Natural World, and Kara Romero, Panapunu Wugai, Living Light. In 2025, she co-edited Re-Envisioning American Art, Transforming Museum Practice, which was published by the University of Washington Press. She's on the board of directors for the Native American Art Studies Association and serves on advisory boards for Panorama and the Terra Foundation for American Art. And with that, I will hand it over to Jami to get us started.
Thank you so much, Magley. It's so nice to be with you all today. I'm joining you from the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Abenaki people and here at Dartmouth College at the Hood Museum. And I am really excited to be in conversation with Candice today. Anything you want to say before I dive into questions, Candice?
Just that I am also really honored to be here, and I'm so grateful to be in dialogue with Jami, one of my favorite people, one of my favorite thinkers, and to also talk about this new book. So grateful for the invitation, and I'm joining you from the ancestral territories of the Mohiknuk people, and yeah, just really happy for this dialogue and to share more of the process and the thinking behind the book.
Yeah, so just to let folks know a little bit about the format, I have so many questions about this beautiful new book that has just come out. Uh, and it's you might refer to it as a tome. It's, well over 500 pages. And so we will talk about this for about an hour and then open it up to some question and dialogue with those of you who are joining us today. So I think I'll dive right in because, 550 plus pages and only an hour to discuss. There's definitely a lot to cover. This reader is a companion and product of the exhibition Indian Theater, Native Performance, Art, and Self-Determination since 1969, which opened at the Hessel Museum of Art at CCS Bard in 2023 and has since traveled to other venues. However, it isn't merely a catalog, but as you state in your own words, quote, more than a document of an exhibition, a deeper compendium of text to chart the origins of Native performance art and theater and how subsequent ideas of agency are embedded in artistic practices today. Can you kind of talk about the genesis of, this project, both the exhibition and book, and its connection to Indian theater?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Jamie. So Indian theater as an exhibition, as Jamie mentioned, originated at Bard College at the Center for Curatorial Studies, where I teach, and it's also very close to Forge Project, where I work. And We had about a little over a year to work on this exhibition. And when I was thinking about the exhibition, I was thinking about, what the Native group show might be. I've been in dialogue with a lot of artists, a lot of thinkers, and a lot of curators about both the kind of trappings of that, kind of as an exhibition format. One of the trappings I'd say is that and this is coming from my colleague Kathleen Ashmilby, who's a curator now at the Portland Art Museum. And she said that one of the things that she's noticed about these kinds of surveys of contemporary Native art is that they often concentrate often on the first or on the most recent 5 to 10 years. But she said that it's kind of created a trap because it feels like we are always introducing ourselves and that the opportunity for a kind of in-depth analysis of the origins of different contemporary movements is something that is, I think, deeply needed in our field in curatorial practice. That's something that I was keeping in mind and thinking about the exhibition. But of course, the other is context. So the Center for Curatorial Studies is a school. It's a school that trains young curators. It's also a school that I graduated from in 2003. So I was thinking about, what kind of an exhibition would resonate in this context? And then I was thinking about the different schools of art that have been developed historically for the training of Native contemporary artists. One of which is the Institute of American Indian Arts, which originated in the mid 1960s, first as a high school program and was initially housed in the former Santa Fe Indian School, so boarding school. And it was a boarding school program at the beginning, but not a colonial boarding school at all, highly different. And its origins actually were out of a Rockefeller-funded initiative that Lloyd Kiva-New, who was the first president of IAI, who was an amazing textile designer and artist who trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, the first Native person to graduate from there. And so he was interested in the creation of a vocational school for contemporary artists, and he assembled a faculty in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he was based at the time, that included some of the many luminaries now that we know in Native art. Charles Lolema, Otali Lolema, who taught ceramics. Charles Lolema taught jewelry. Fritz Scholder, the painter, who really kind of redefined how we understand representation and painting in Native art, and many others. And that actually became the core faculty at IAI. But then I was also interested in the first Native Run Art School in Canada. And that was initiated by Bob Boyer a little over 10 years later, actually, 1977 in Saskatchewan, Canada. Um, so but the real origin of the book and the real origin of the exhibition is in this document that you see here, called Indian Theater. It's a treatise that was co-authored by Lloyd Kiva-New together with Roland Meinholtz and together with many students at the time at the Institute of American Indian Arts who were studying with them, but particularly studying dance and performance in theater. So this document in 1969, published by IAI, for me was a watershed. I found out about it when I was a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, which is the museum associated with the Institute of American Indian Arts. And to me, it was really profound. It was profound for a number of reasons. One, contemporary Indian theater, as they were calling it, or new Native theater, which was another term that they used, didn't actually exist. They wanted to invent it. And in that invention, they weren't trying to be prescriptive. Instead, they did it through the framework of notes. The whole second half of the treatise is actually all scripts that were authored by students at the time. And it was entirely propositional. And I thought that was pretty amazing. In it as well was a kind of critique of how they thought theater was taught at the time. And they were questioning, like, why are we looking to European forms of theater, in particular Greek comedy and tragedy, when performance in these lands has, thousands of years old trajectory in practice. So why is this being overlooked? And if this is being overlooked, how do we use those forms? And in those forms, they were pretty inclusive. So they included like powwow, ceremony, and things like that, storytelling, oration as potential frameworks that students could draw from. Um, but they were deeply invested in the contemporary. And in being deeply invested in the contemporary, one of the first things that emerged from this document was actually the commissioning of the Italian designer. He was never actually formally an architect, but people call him an architect, Paolo Soleri. And Paolo Soleri designed the first stage for them. And it was a pretty profound stage, I would have to say. So I was really interested in this kind of moment of experimentation, this moment of self-determination. And so then a question I had is, how did this document come to be in 1969? What else was in the air in 1969? And the more that I looked into it, the more that, of course, I realized that there were kind of two things that were happening to shape what then has become known as the self-determination era in the United States. So some 6 months later was the occupation of Alcatraz by the self-named Indians of all tribes. The majority of them were students from University of California, Berkeley. They occupied Alcatraz as a test of a Lakota treaty from the late 1800s that promised all federal surplus land to be given back to Lakota people. And Alcatraz had been designated surplus land because the prison was no longer functioning. That became a real leverage, but also importantly, their stage for talking about Native issues nationally. It was one of the largest stages we'd ever had, which was pretty fascinating. But then when I was doing oral histories as part of this book, and one of which was with Pete Jemison, Seneca artist who was living in the Bay Area at the time, he said, something that people don't talk about is a lot of those folks who were part of Indians of all tribes and who occupied Alcatraz and became part of that movement. They were trained in theater. They were participating in radical street theater. So then my thinking kind of shifted after that point, and I thought, okay, what does performance and theater, how is that and how has that been a methodology for the understanding of both self-determination and sovereignty? So visual sovereignty, legal sovereignty, other forms of performance sovereignty, and how do we parse that out? And to make a kind of long answer, Jami, shorter, I would say that the reader, as an exhibition maker, I often think that one thing catalogs can do is be a document of an exhibition. But what I wanted this reader to do was to expand on that and be a document of the ways in which self-determination and sovereignty have always been at the heart of our aesthetic practices. And the ways in which that's been done is often through performance. So we assembled an editorial team. We had a long list initially of over 100 articles, and this was done in research with my colleague Amelia Russo here at Forge. And from there, we developed the book into a series of chapters. So using this document, Indian Theater, as an inspiration, we commissioned more than 20 artists to write notes. But then the chapters kind of started to evolve based on the short list that we wanted to include of important articles, essays, all the way back to 1969, as well as this kind of gaps. And the gaps that we identified were those which we commissioned new texts for. And also inspired by the notes, then I wrote different chapter headings for all the different ways in which the book is a kind of compendium. So like Indian theater, it is an experiment, not in progress, but in process. And I wasn't interested in writing a kind of fixed art history, but instead a kind of multitude of beginnings.
So I think if we could go to the next slide, Magli, I want to get certainly into a deeper conversation about sovereignty and self-determination. But first, kind of sticking with our discussion of this treatise, You talk about how you use the treatise, both as the opening to the book and then as an exit, not as a closing, right? You're very careful not to say it's a closing, but that it's an exit. And we can talk more about what you mean there. But this last line here really resonated with me as something that uh, that I felt in recent years. So it says the momentum is exciting with every indication that the potential can be realized. Um, you know, can you talk a little bit just about like the cautious optimism ingrained within this and the belief that uh Lloyd Keevaneu had as an educator, as someone who, kind of founded this institution based on this belief in Native people, in our own people.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also love that line. I'm glad that you picked up on it because I feel like what this document was is it was all about potential and it was all about, the ethos of self-determination. And that is that, we define our own futures and we do that from our own perspectives. And so he was kind of putting this on the table together with his collaborators to say, you know, this is not only something to be realized, the potential to be realized, but another line that I kept returning to is that everything in that document was to be tested on stage. So then I was thinking of the exhibition as a kind of stage in and of itself. What potential does that offer? And thinking of performance as something that also for us has had like one thing that I often turn to a lot is this line that came out of a land agreement and actually a land claims dispute in British Columbia, Canada, with the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en people. And that was the first land claim wherein song and dance could be used as official legal evidence of land ownership for and was justifiable under a kind of colonial law. And what they said in their testimony is a strict law bids us dance. And so that idea that all of this has the potential to be realized was not only about a kind of artistic experimentation, but for me, it had kind of deeper resonances in terms of how dance and performance are not just a part of kind of like what we do as culture, but indeed what we do as governance, how this sort of intersects with things like sovereignty. Um, so with that in mind, I just wanted to share a little bit about Lloyd Keevaneu and what I kind of understand as his praxis. So Lloyd, as I said, was a really well-known fashion designer in the 60s or in the 50s. He had the Kiva Craft Center in Scottsdale, Arizona. His neighbor was Frank Lloyd Wright, and Frank Lloyd Wright actually first offered to design the Kiva. Actually, he offered to design, as far as I understand it, some buildings for Institute of American Indian Arts, and what Lloyd Keevaneu wrote in his autobiography is like I would never be able to afford that. So, he just kind of didn't take that on. But the reason I mention it is because Lloyd Keevaneu was really interested in the potential of modernism. So the potential of the proliferation of Native ideas and design into every American home. And he kind of said this. And so that's why he worked as a fashion designer. And in fact, he created a kind of a textile workshop in Scottsdale where he worked together with many younger people and students to create textile designs that he thought could then be kind of mass marketed. And some of them were to a kind of more modest degree. But the reason I say that is because for him, this was indeed kind of all about potential. And he translated that textile workshop as a method that they incorporated in the early days of IAIA. But something in that potential to be realized that I think was pretty incredible as well is that he empowered students to not only see their work out in the world, but to also be co-authors of this document. So it wasn't a kind of leadership that you often see in a lot of other institutions, but one that was really about elevating their voices and thinking actually about what stages they could occupy and how they want to do it.
Yeah, and I think that there's also something there, kind of with like the vocational model of IAIA and the idea that it was a space that, it was a laboratory. It was a space that was intended for experimentation and innovation. And there's, I think, um, there we often see this, I think, in mainstream or more Western context. Um, tradition as something that, is in the past. And I think it was toward the end of the book, but there's in one of the notes or essays written by Kite, she talks about tradition as technology. And it brought me back to the idea of like, the innovative means and, really that vocational education and kind of learning by doing and enacting in the apprentice model is something that's deeply rooted within Indigenous epistemologies. Um,
Yeah, absolutely, Jamie. You're absolutely right. When you look at the collection at Institute of American Indian Arts, there's the honors collection, and the honors collection is called that because that was the work that was acquired by students in those early years of experimentation. And what is pretty incredible about that collection is you see students from the Northwest Coast, so where there's a strong carving and graphic tradition, and they're working in ceramics. You see Hopi students doing the same thing. You see people who are working in weaving, but not, let's say, in the way that we might associate with more traditional Navajo weaving, but in fact, kind of making like wall works that look like or could be inspired by Sheila Hicks. What was fascinating to me about that is that Lloyd Kiva knew and the teachers who were working there through that apprenticeship model were not adhering to a certain kind of medium specificity that had defined different economies of Native art. So the idea that, Hopi folks make a certain kind of ceramics, for example, but instead it was guided by innovation and this idea that, in fact, students could work in any medium that they were inspired by. And I'd say since that time, the 60s, and this might be a controversial statement, but it's actually the market and collectors' desires that have created and invented this idea of what so-called traditional art is. Because a lot of artists, because art is also an economy, started reflecting, some of those desires back, right? And but I, in its inception, was not interested in kind of any of that. But in fact, what Lloyd Kiva New said was the idea that cultural difference can be the basis for experimentation.
mhm. Yeah. Um, so you also said that, like the creating this was also a project of, making a book that you wish you had when you were younger. And you talk about it by saying, like the treatise, this book is not framed as a complete history. Consider it more akin to the first edition of a textbook intended to be revised, rewritten, debated, and expanded. Um, and then, now that I'm seeing this picture of, the Spider Woman Theater, you talk about their kind of practice of story weaving.
Mhm.
And I think that really resonates with like what this reader is. That there's different modalities present throughout this entire text. There's, essays that have been previously published, there's archival documents, there's documentation of visual art, there's poetry, comics, scripts from performances, and interviews. This isn't like any textbook I've ever seen before.
That's very deliberate. So the prior slide, and we don't need to go back to it, but it's an oral history of Spider Women theater. There's also an oral history with um, Pete Jemison. There's an oral history of Theo Cuthand. There's an oral history that's been authored by Miss Chief egotistical herself. Um, Part of the reason for that was also the ability to collaborate with students because, the original treatise was made in collaboration and in dialogue with students. So some of those oral histories were conducted together with students of myself and Suzanne Snyder as part of an oral history class that we took or we led. But then it was also because one thing we realized as we were creating this compendium, it's more of a compendium, is a lot of the histories that we hold are still held orally. And I thought that that was a kind of funny irony. So one way to get them into the page, of course, was to do these oral histories. And also Rebecca Belmore is another who participated in this. But in making this compendium or this reader, um, I thought it was really important to find space for all the different ways in which we have published. So that's through text, image, poetry, um, academic essays, notes that were written in response, because I wanted to open up our discourse. Like one of the things that I thought in thinking that this was something that was needed and something I definitely wanted when I was a student is number one, I had a lot of feedback that every time someone teaches a class on Native art, they're often, creating their syllabus from scratch because there's no text. Or if you're using the kind of Oxford art history on Native art, that was actually first published in 1983. Like it doesn't really accommodate all the shifts that have happened now. It also wasn't something that was necessarily seen as by or for Native people. It's also written in an art historical voice, which doesn't always accommodate the different ways that we kind of do the work of art. So I wanted something that actually reflected our practices, but also reflected the kind of energy of the practices that we do. Um, and also thinking about like how a book itself performs. I think it performs in very different ways. And Jami, as you've noted, like thinking about, you know, the agency not only of the artists and authors that we work together with, the agency of the original inspiration, the actions in 1969, the treatise in 1969, but also the agency of the reader in determining their own path. And, in that way, it was a bit inspired by a book called Water Kinship Belief that I co-edited. That's a compendium that came after the Toronto Biennial of Art. And this is done by the same designer, Santiago da Silva, where readers are also encouraged to kind of choose their own paths. So that's why there's groupings of texts that feed into one another. But again, I'm always, I think, really critical of texts that try to be decisive. I feel like, or the kind of the art history on a certain kind of movement, because art histories are always subjective. And this wasn't trying to be a history again. It's trying to be a kind of action orientated, an action orientated thing in and of itself.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a student yesterday. We're in the second week of the term and, already have, worried students coming to say, are my discussion posts what you're looking for? I said, this is something that is, I want it to be what's useful for you. It's an exercise of, like the reality of being a professor is the need to grade and the need to, you know, have this objective way of, evaluating student performance. But what I'm more interested in is like, what are the students getting from this material? What questions do they have? Not as, as a means of like regurgitating and summarizing, but like, how is this, enabling them to grapple with what's happening in our world currently, or, things they're discussing in their other classes. That kind of freedom can be overwhelming, I think, to young people. Have you had that experience in your teaching and, your interactions with, people who are like, this is supposed to be a certain way, and I don't know what to do when I'm given this freedom and space?
Yeah. Yes, I teach a class called Native Art and Artists, and I teach it at Forge. In part because we have that context of where we're working, but also then because we're surrounded by art by native artists. The art is literally there hanging on the walls, so there's not always that kind of distance. We don't have to go to a museum to encounter it or see it. But sometimes I think that there's a lot of anxiety in terms of getting something right, as though there's only one right way to interpret or write about, especially works by native artists. And I think that there's a lot of trepidation. I'd say that this isn't just with students, but trepidation amongst other writers and critics. And I think sometimes that there's actually not enough writing about native art or even art criticism because people feel like they don't have enough of a background to do it. And so then that creates its own version of silencing. So what I was interested in the book is putting this all forward as different kinds of tools, different kinds of perspectives. It was also inspired by that course that I teach, and it will be the basis now of going forward. Um, to try to create, like, one of the ways that I've responded, and I don't know if this is the same for you, Jamie, but is by, amassing things, like amassing all of these incredible texts, like Jolene Rickard's, which was a slide before, called Sovereignty, a Line in the Sand, that was published in 1994 by Aperture. And the reason that was published then is because Jolene was part of a collective of Native photographers. A lot of them were living and working in New York in the 1980s, and they were practicing what they termed Native visual sovereignty. And so it was the marker of the beginning of not only a practice, but a theoretical idea. And so what I wanted to do as well is chart this evolution of the idea of Native visual sovereignty into what Dylan Robinson starts to call performing sovereignty or doing sovereignties. So thinking of sovereignty as a kind of collective thing. So the book necessarily also charts a trajectory of thought. But again, with the idea that there's no single way of understanding this, but there's a multitude of perspectives, right?
Yeah, and I also love that there's that early essay from the 90s from Jolene, but then a more recent essay where she's also talking about visual sovereignty. So you can see actually how, the argument and the way she's thinking about this has changed and, transformed through interaction and through, critique and engagement with other scholars and scholars who are former students of hers. And then there's also the interview that she did, the conversation with Kite. And so you get to see her interacting in this different way. And so I really appreciate being able to, like in this one text, having, that kind of being able to witness the trajectory of this artist and scholar who's so seminal in the field, but also like a dialogue where they're, just kind of engaging in conversation, and not, writing as an academic in that moment.
Yeah.
Um,
Her last essay is on thinking about visual sovereignty in the age of biometrics. And Jamie, like, we were able to kind of throw out the kind of regular rules. Like, we didn't have rules where we said, there can only be one essay by one author. But thinking of it instead in terms of like the spirit of generosity, like how can we put this knowledge out and also exactly that, like show its transformation, its evolution, how, for example, Dylan Robinson's responding to that, how Dylan Robinson and Jolene cite Robert Royer's ideas of sovereignty in
yeah.
that. So you start to see how these ideas and also how they're taken up by artists are also call and response.
Yeah. So I want to shift to talk about sovereignty and self-determination, which is core um to the argument you're making in the book and really, kind of I think that first section where you talk about, this moment in 1968, 69, and, all of the things that converged to create the art that was coming out, the changes in legislation, the beginning of, the era of self-determination. I think I've told you this story before, but when I was spending a lot of time staying with my grandparents in Oklahoma while I was doing my dissertation research, was kind of at the height of protests and activism around mascots, and this visual symbol of the dehumanization of Native people. And I would talk to my grandpa and mention things about visual sovereignty. He goes, you know what? We have more important things to worry about. This isn't like, why didn't you go to law school? Like, and this idea. And then I had a professor in grad school, a Native professor, who really disliked visual sovereignty as a concept and claimed that it was, an erosion of juridical sovereignty. Um, can you talk about like why it's so important from your perspective, and that we talk about sovereignty as enacted through performance and the arts, and how it contributes to these larger conversations around self-determination and, the instances of, court cases and, you know, the exercise of sovereignty in the political space?
Yeah, that's a great and tough question, Jamie. And I know that you shared this with me before too, this critique that people have had of the idea of visual sovereignty. So one, I think of it, what I think and I've been inspired by is this idea that exists in multitudes, that it's not just in the kind of legal or juridical space. Although um, that's certainly how sovereignty is enacted. But, coming from my own community, which operates from a potlatch system. So potlatch is just sort of like in general, in short, uh, are the ways that governance systems are upheld. And it's done through ensuring the health and well-being of a community. We also gather to honor those who have passed, and to like what we call the other side camp. It's a way to honor marriages, changes of status, let's say. Um, so to say, the reason that I'm saying that is because I feel like, in that enactment, we are enacting sovereignty, and we have used that as the basis of our um, land agreement, our contemporary land agreement at Carcross Tagish First Nation with the federal government. Um, but to say that the way in which sovereignty is enacted is just through the legal sense, I think can be limiting, because I feel like that's coming from, let's say, ways in which we've been forced to negotiate with government, right? And it doesn't always honor the ways in which we have enacted governance ourselves. So there's an amazing image in Jolene's essay where she's showing an image of her relatives, including Cayuga leaders, walking in a procession with a wampum. The wampum, of course, being the visual representation of treaty, but the procession being a necessary enactment in real life. And you could say that it comes and is using the kind of praxis of performance. And it's a necessary way to underscore our sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I would say that this absolutely operates in multitudes. And to get back to the kind of difference, I would say, between self-determination and sovereignty. So historically, in 1969, the 72-month occupation of Alcatraz Island was used as the basis to negotiate with the federal government. And it was then President Nixon. And as a result, he actually halted the Federal Indian Relocation Act, which was a huge federal land grab. So they were successfully able to use Alcatraz as a stage, even though doing so in many ways undermined Ohlone traditional territory, so California native traditional territory. But I think that they were very conscious of how they could leverage that and leverage, let's say, the not only the kind of media representation, but really use media, including radio, including newspapers, including their spokespeople, um, as a means to create change in federal Indian policy. Um,
Mhm.
and I would say that they did so using performative sovereignty as their praxis, honestly.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up that, which is also in the book, the way that Ohlone sovereignty was undermined, and it was, these predominantly Lakota organizers, kind of speaking on behalf of all Native people, and so thinking about like I often talk with my students and others about like possibilities and limitations. And so there's like the possibilities that are opened up by, speaking or, protesting as a group of all Native people. Um, but then there's the limitation of, who's left out. And, that undermining. And I really appreciate, that example, but also, examples elsewhere in the text, particularly in many of the interviews, where you kind of reveal this complexity and nuance that is, at once prevalent in our lives, but often absent in the public spaces we occupy. Um, whether it be museums or, publications, the kind of talks we give at different times. We don't talk about these moments of friction or contradiction. But that's something that's featured at different moments in the book, but also in section 4 on contrariness as this, you know, inherent uh um like social structure within many of our communities.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that you picked up on that. And that section is inspired by a dialogue that is republished by Cheryl Rondell and Joseph Natauhau and Richard William Hill. And it's on being contrary. And so, the idea of the kind of quote unquote trickster, and the reason I'm putting that in quotes because I think that it's been the inspiration for a lot of non-native misinformation. But what they were kind of talking about is that idea of to be contrary, so to perform the contrary in life or in story or in action is really a kind of amazing practice and a traditional practice that we have, but it enables these kinds of different forms of openings. And then, another amazing artist who's part of that section is Demian Deniache, whose prose poem is not republished in its complete length because it's entirely long, but it is a very, very long excerpt necessarily as part of that kind of not only the enacting of being contrary, but because what Demian is doing is, I think, through their words, um, you know, forming a kind of necessary provocation. So how do we embody in books these kinds of differences of opinion? How do we embody provocation? How do we think of the kind of contrary, to be contrary, as something that we embrace and make space for, and think of its own kind of form of method? So yeah, that's really where that was coming from.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'm also really glad one of my favorite essays to teach, Eve Tuck and Kei-Wen Yang, decolonization is not a metaphor, right? That there is that danger of, kind of using Indigenous ways of knowing within, an academic or artistic context so that they're removed from protocol and other things that are associated with them in community, and other meanings are attached, right? And so I think that it's not part of that chapter on contrariness, but it very well could have been.
Yeah.
I think the other essay that I really love that's in that section or interview is the interview with James Luna, Call Me in 93. Um, I think it's, something that if you're in the field, you know about, but if you're, outside of it, it's, so I think I'm glad that that is getting another life, because I think it's really relevant today, thinking about, um, kind of that 500th anniversary of um, Columbus's, voyage and non-discovery, and that celebration and how, everyone was interested in working with Native artists to commemorate that. And we're in this commemorative year in the United States where the US it's 250 this year. And there's, a lot of we have a series of shows that is kind of looking at, what kind of American art histories do we want to tell for the next 250 years? And what's possible. But, this idea of feeling like there are moments and there's this ebb and flow of interest in Native art. Do you think that that's the case now, or do you feel like there's, a permanence to the existence of Native art as part of contemporary art?
Yeah. Amazing question. Yeah, that essay or that interview, Call Me in 93, was published in High Performance, and we also included a copy of High Performance. It travels as part of the exhibition. Because it was important for me that James's words and his questions and his critiques, which feel very valid now, are accessible to folks. And, you know, this is my own perspective, but I feel like obviously there are moments when people sort of look to Native art or in some cases adopt nativeness. And I often say that it's in times of colonial crisis. So if we look back, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a kind of turn to nativeness because of the alienation that people were feeling because of that, because of this loss of certain kinds of practices and dominant society. Then the counterculture movement, there was another kind of turn to native spirituality, which was highly appropriative. In the climate crisis, which we are living in and also actively producing, there's again a kind of turn to like nativeness as a kind of quote unquote solution. I feel like, so I'm kind of naming the problem, but I also feel like the forms in which we have and the histories in which we lean on, and Jami, you also actively produce as an exhibition maker and as an author and as a scholar. Um, I feel like we aren't a trend anymore, in part because I think there's different aspects of the art world. And for a moment, we were missing some critical areas of support. So, there's scholarship, there's exhibitions, there's critical writing. There's, of course, the amazing artists that have always been around, just haven't had the support that they've needed. Um, there's acquisitions both in mainstream museums as well as those who've always supported Native art, which tend to be more regionally specific. But for a long time, there wasn't a lot of support in the art market. Wasn't a lot of support in private collections that more expansively collect contemporary Native art. Um, and there was very little representation for us in like kind of, I would say, in more mainstream spaces. And if it was fleeting, or it was thematic, or it was because of the tireless advocacy of people like Jean Courtesy Smith. So I hope that we've moved from kind of special interest topic into, and this is why this book was so important to me, is that, it was really important to me to show how, our practices of performance, our practices of self-determination, our practices of sovereignty have not only created their own art histories, but they impact the field more broadly. And so that's why I felt like it was really important that we do a reader and not a catalog. I in my work, I try really hard to create platforms that deliberately are large so that they can't be ignored. Because I
Yeah.
feel like, a lot of what we do has been dismissed or seen as like, oh, that's just a show about identity or whatever. Like, I'm
Mhm.
always really interested in the ways that the work that we've done has been dismissed and kind of like thinking about what is the underlying reason for that. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And having, I think that space for, for texts like this, I think, um, in the same way that you said you created the book you wish you had when you were younger, that was really the impetus for the re-envisioning histories of American art book that I edited with Michael Hartman. And it was the first peer-reviewed book that the Hood Museum had. We co-published with University of Washington Press and Academic Press, and I really had to push for that here, kind of internally, not because, people didn't think it was important, but because it adds extra layer of work and more time and more cost. And it's not necessary within a lot of the publishing that we do in terms of catalogs. But, for a reader, like things that are peer reviewed are taken seriously in a way and taught, by faculty at colleges, both in undergraduate and graduate programs in a way that, catalogs still aren't. I teach with catalogs all the time. But I don't think that is the standard. I think that's changing. Um, can you talk about a little bit about kind of like the challenge of, kind of writing and finding the time to write while also being, an exhibition maker, a curator, and, like all the admin work that you do as, the director of a Forge project?
Well, I would say first an apology to our co-publishers, especially Dancing Foxes, because initially we thought this could be done in a year. That was very ambitious. I'd say for the record, I don't know who could do a 560-page book in a year, because it was challenging to find the space to write. And so what I do deliberately is I block off time and I just get up incredibly early, sometimes like 5 in the morning, where I have a lot of clarity to write, because I feel like that mode, I need to protect that time when I can think critically and I can read really deeply, because like all of us, I live in the time of the attention economy, and I feel like as soon as the emails start coming in, it's really hard to kind of cordon off that time. So I I do that either early in the morning or on the weekends, or I actually took a retreat it's called the Hermitage, which is a residency program in Florida where I had a full week to do the research and the basis of the writing. But I find I have to be really deliberate about blocking off that time. And I think it's probably the same for any writer. It's probably the same for you, Jamie.
Yeah, no, and I think, I really wish that there was the time and space and resources for curators to write, because the work that's coming out of museums and the praxis of practitioners, is so important, that we're the way that what scholarship is taught is probably behind a decade or two in a lot of programs because of the reliance on, publications to lead those conversations, in the classroom. One,
I wonder, do we need to turn to questions, Jamie, or do we
I have
still?
one more question before we go to, um, uh, this. And, one thing that I think resonated throughout the text for me and, kind of particularly in the interviews is kind of the honesty and unvarnished accounts that people give. And, I think that's so important, for for young people to see and to hear and to understand that, it wasn't always easy, that people struggled, that people, acknowledged it, like, hey, I did this thing and it was a dumb decision. Like the Pete Jebba said, I laughed throughout that entire interview. But also with, the James Luna and Jolene Rickard interviews, they all talk about the importance of the relationships they had with people, and that concept of relationality is, I don't like, not explicitly a theme of the book, but it's a thread that runs throughout. Can you talk a bit about, kind of the relationships and their impact on the field and, their inclusion in this text?
Yeah, that I'm so happy that you've asked that question because there are these threads, and very deliberate ones, but they're threads. And so for those who are close readers, you'll see that in the script that Jeffrey Gibson created, and which stars Ariel Twist. Ariel Twist is an amazing performer and writer who lives in Halifax. Ariel's script deliberately cites Ayanna Miracle. And Ayanna Miracle in the text provides, and Ayanna's no longer living, but Ayanna was a trans performer, performance artist trained in theater, but also a curator who was living and working primarily in Vancouver, especially in her later life. And what she provides is this kind of like snapshot of what performance was like in that moment in Vancouver. It's intimate, it's honest, just as you said. It makes you feel like you were there. And I know a lot of the folks that she's talking about. But I wanted that, see, it's not only relationality, but it's the way that we honor those who've created spaces for us. And so that's throughout. And that's why, you have this intergenerational conversation between Kite and Jolene Rickard, for example. And you have all these people kind of calling out to others. And it's because it's the way in which we work. And it's also to show that kind of web of relations through this book, and how close people are, and how a lot of folks were collaborators and are collaborators with one another. Um, so absolutely, that is the what the book surfaces, very intentionally. Yeah.
And I know we're transitioning, Magley. I have one more question because you brought up the Jeffrey Gibson, the kind of script to Don't Make Me Over, and the notes after, both by Jeffrey and Ariel, the performer. So thinking about performance art as a medium or as a field, um, oftentimes it isn't documented or published. Or if it is documented, it's not archived, and it's hard to kind of find the records of these performances. But it's so powerful if you see it. And even, I'm thinking like things that have been documented, so like James Luna, his artifact piece, because it was documented, it's this, kind of seminal uh, uh, piece in the field, not just of performance art, like writ large, but of Native art as well. Um, was there something about like documenting performances that was also a big part of this project for you?
Yeah, so it goes back to the inspiration from the Indian theater treatise, and that is that these are things to be tested on stage. And so that's why it was really important to publish this full script that Jeffrey Gibson wrote, including with its notes to the performers. You see, like when someone's supposed to enter the stage, when a light is meant to change, and that was the first script and first theater piece that Jeffrey's ever done. But it was also that idea, inspired by the treatise, that they also published scripts, because they were all frameworks for performance. And that's why scorers also have a really important role in this book. And you see Asenayak's commissioned essay on why I write scores. You also have Tanya Lukin Linklater's Shook, which is a series of scores, because these are also invitations, I feel like, for actions from others. So in that way, there's an invitation through this book for other things to be performed. So, and that this is the kind of beginning of kind of other actions in the world, not ones that are simply kind of held in the page, but not only in the real world, but also in the kind of world of art, which is its own real world too.
Thank you. All right, Magley, I think we're ready for discussion.
Thank you both so much. This was such a wonderful conversation. To our audience members, if you have a question for Candice or Jami, there is a link in the chat where you can submit your question and we will turn to you next. The first question asks, can you speak more to the possibilities of humor as a method of cultural critique and reconciliation inside of contested spaces, such as a performance stage, a museum, or a government institution?
Yeah, I think we can both speak to that. I feel like James Luna was an amazing example. So it wasn't just his kind of performance sculptures, I would call them. Like one is called High Tech Peace Pipe, and it's a beaded piece of bathroom plumbing. So, it's absurd, but it's doing something that could be considered a kind of cultural taboo, and that you're kind of remaking a ceremonial object out of things that you can kind of find at the hardware store. But it opens something up. I think humor enables these kinds of forms of slippages and dialogue or these forms of critique that might be hard to do otherwise. I would say that also James's artifact piece had a notion of humor too. And for him, like, it was it was absurd and ridiculous that, what he learned through that performance, and this was a performance that was done in the mid 80s, first performed at the Manitoba or at the San Diego Museum of Man, where he put himself on display. And the endurance performance part of it was he taught himself to breathe imperceptibly so that people, thought that there was a native body on display. And he said he thought it was so profound and also funny that the only time people had issue with his body being on display was when they realized he was alive, he was still living. So I think it's actually been one of the most effective ways that a lot of artists have intervened to talk about really serious issues, like why is it that we're comfortable with native bodies being on display? This was only the 80s, and Rebecca Belmore did the same with her kind of form of piece. And so it's also that tactic of being contrary that they're doing, and they're exercising to, great success, I'd say.
Yeah, I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was at MoMA, and they have the Guillermo Gomez Pena, Coco Fusco couple in the cage in their collection and on view. And I love teaching with that piece, and it's the same thing, right? It's humor being used to both critique but also open a space for dialogue. And I think humor as a strategy is something that, has consistently been employed in the as a method of, social control within our communities. And, oftentimes, teasing is a way of teaching, right? That these little moments are a way to kind of correct behavior, or to call out something without, kind of making it into something larger than it needs to be. But I also think that, especially in today, and for those who came before us, like, laughter is medicine. There's so many moments in the book. I love the way that you put laughter in brackets, throughout the interviews, to show that, it can be this Sometimes it's, a release of this pressure valve, to kind of like, when talking about something difficult, or when reflecting upon the absurd. But it is also, I think a way to open up a dialogue. And I think that, Native people, um, are really good at it. Uh, and really good, so much that it makes other people uncomfortable. I think I've had that experience a lot recently. I use a lot of self-deprecating humor in spaces, and it makes some of my colleagues very uncomfortable. But I think it's also, a way to kind of convey our shared humanity. Um, and to demonstrate that we are grappling with the complexity and multiplicity of, and entanglements of what's existing in this current moment. Um, and so it's just like we laugh so we don't cry, um, is a
Yeah.
line I use a lot.
We exist in like completely absurd conditions in a lot of ways. But I also, Jamie, you also kind of secretly, I think, have a background as a stand-up comedian. So just to say that you know humor very, very well. So
Well, I did that one time in Santa Fe, do a stand-up routine, mostly because I wanted to challenge myself to do something that made me nervous and afraid, because, speaking like this to you is, there's lots of wonderful people here. But I used to get really nervous before public speaking, and I don't anymore. And I don't know, I feel like I wanted something to work at. And then it's also, an interest of mine, in my research. And I wrote an essay about humor as medicine, in the work of Bob Houses, an Apache, Chiricahua Apache sculptor, the son of Alan Hauser, and that his work in a lot of ways, I think, is so far beyond, and his use of humor is years beyond what even a lot of people in our community are ready to address. And I think that gets me to actually another question for you, Candice, which is, kind of there's 48 contributors in the book. But there's also, so much that was necessarily left out. How hard was it to make those decisions of, what's included and what's not included?
oh, it was incredibly hard. That's where I was so thankful that we had this editorial committee who came with so many incredible ideas. And like I said, we had initially suggestions, a long list of over 100. And we worked on refining it together with them, together with us. Once we started, thinking about the different chapters, then things kind of filtered. But then we also realized where the gaps were. Um, and, some things really came into focus. It was also really helpful to have worked on that in tandem with the exhibition because I think a lot of things were revealed once the exhibition was open about, what is going to be really important to be a part of the legacy. I think books become the legacy of exhibitions, as well as a thing in and unto themselves. But I was also thinking really critically about like what methods are artists using and how do we represent that? And so that became its own kind of editorial filter. Um, yeah, very hard, but good guides.
Thank you. The next question is, you mentioned the insufficiencies of the art historical voice in describing a native visual sovereignty. How do you imagine art critics, curators, and researchers might shift to a more expansive register?
Hmm. Well, that's why this book is as expansive as it is, because where I feel there's a kind of lack of representation is the kind of depth, urgency, and practices of Native artists and performers. weren't well represented, I don't think, yet in print. Um, or were accessible through all these various means, through conferences and things that I had experienced, including amazing conferences on Native performance like Indian Acts, which took place at Grant Gallery in Vancouver. And so we've been organizing all of these events and experiencing them. And just a shout out to Charlotte Rondell, who I see is here and was also part of that and is also part of the book. Um, but I feel like sometimes there's, and this isn't, I think this is also, Jami, why you did your book, is I felt like there was a disconnect sometimes in art historical texts because they weren't capturing that energy necessarily. They weren't capturing that practice, and they weren't capturing the ways in which we often communicate and we often perform, which is not, always in that kind of like uh, in what we call the art historical voice. And I feel like sometimes when we try to historicize, there's also maybe a like closing in or closing down or try an attempt to make something definitive, things that I'm always like super cautious of. Or this kind of like voice of authority. I'm also very cautious of that voice of authority because it's been really weaponized. It's been weaponized as a way to exclude us from, let's say, the kind of greater art historical canon. It's been in a way to kind of temper our voices or to temper this like messiness or contrariness or like, all the things that the best performances do, and the best performances intervene. So, so a tip I'd say is like, and this is what I try to do in my own writing. I'm not sure I achieved it necessarily in this book, is like, how do I adopt that as a methodology for the way in which I also write? And so I look to people like Ray Belcour, who I think, and Billy Ray has an amazing text in there called To Be Embodied, as the source of inspiration of like how I can push myself, how I can push my own voice. Because I always see these writers and these artists as the things that I aspire to.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, one of the things that I've become particularly interested in is, obviously we're within this space of, the field of Native art, but also, as part of American art, as part of contemporary art, in these other spaces. And, the frame of art as, kind of like this Western defined entity is very limiting. And those limitations are not only placed upon Native art um, and creative practice, but on, art from other communities as well. And so one of the things that I have appreciated in recent years is the way that, a text like this can be picked up, or curatorial strategies or research strategies that are being employed by Native practitioners that are informed by culturally relevant ways of knowing and being in the world can also be applied by non-Native folks to, you know, to engage with work from a more holistic um, perspective that, isn't, based on the canon, but based on context and interaction and engagement, and how, over time the work and its meaning changes as the audience who engage with that work change.
Thank you for those answers. We have two more questions. One of them is for me. I was very curious about this idea of story weaving, Candice. And I'm just curious about you deviating from how you said like a book normally performs, and why was it so important for you to do this? And yeah, because it feels like then the book itself becomes a stage for performance in the way that you're kind of weaving in and out of genre and what you choose to include and not include.
Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly how I thought of the process of making this. Megally, and so story weaving as a term originates from Spider Woman Theater, and Spider Woman Theater next year, or this year actually, will celebrate 50 years of operations. So they are the longest running, as far as they know, active theater troupe in the United States, which is pretty incredible. Their origins are as a feminist theater group started by three sisters, and they were really interested in this very idea, like how do you take very particular kinds of methodologies. So they were interested in story weaving as kind of emerging from Spider Woman, so the Navajo deity who bestowed weaving as a practice to and brought it to Navajo people, but also there's a similar figure for Hopi folks, and so they thought about weaving as a method that they could use to produce theater, and they used that as a way to provide agency to all of their collaborators. And so their collaborators would actively bring in stories from their lives. Some of those stories in the early days were about violence against women. So they were bringing their real life experiences with that. The absurdity of it, Jami, like they're talking about how, like, why is it that men always perform these certain ways when they're trying to enact violence on us, and just like exposing that as just like absolutely ridiculous, and people could actually laugh about it as a way to talk about something that's really hard to speak through. And so thinking of all those threads that get woven throughout that book, it really is a kind of form not only of story weaving, let's say, but as like creating these different layers of reference as forms of homage, because I think that that's what we do in general as a practice as well. So it was again like trying to create these layers and these references that you kind of come back to and come back to as a way of thinking about how stories themselves are never told in one way. There's always different ways to interpret them. There's always different ways, different kind of access points. So thinking of that kind of openness, let's say, as its framework too.
Yeah, and I just will say that, weaving as, a metaphor that is, ingrained in the material practices of so many Indigenous communities in North America and beyond, is, something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and also talking with friends and colleagues, who are coming from a space of, you know, Black feminist studies and standpoint theory, and thinking about like braiding and weaving as a metaphor that is shared as, kind of this entry point to kind of bridge that gap
Yeah.
of understanding and scholarship, and how we exist in these very separate spaces, though we share a lot uh, of histories and the trajectory of art within our communities, particularly in North America, has followed similar trajectories, but has not been, studied
Yeah, exactly.
together.
And there's a literal woven poem in the near the center of the book by Eric Paul Reach and Suhan Ho.
Thank you both for answering my question. The last question comes from Hub Overly, who asks, are there specific goals that you two have for your work in Native art, i.e., for art to achieve political change, elevate Indigenous life on mainstream stages in academia or arts institutions, etc.?
Yeah, I want to change the canon. So that's a lofty goal, and that's what I try to do in the work that I do, because I so deeply believe in the incredible work of my collaborators and the artists that I've had the privilege of learning from and working alongside. So that's what I've really dedicated my career to do. And also to call out marginalization when it exists and call out ignorance when it exists, but to actually reshape the stages on which we can occupy.
And I think for me it's that, and one of the ways that I do that is through you know teaching, being at a college that is primarily focused on undergraduate education. and, working closely with students and interns and, hoping and working toward them not having to fight some of the same battles that I fought because, I've benefited from occupying space that, Jean Quick-Tassie Smith and Jolene Rickard and others have opened for me to occupy. And so kind of continuing that legacy of teaching and mentorship that Candice and I have both benefited from so greatly.
I know I said that was the last question, but one more question came in from Robert Kardosh. And Robert asks, should there be canons of Native and Indigenous art? How do we avoid a monolithic narrative of art history without foregoing the possibility of Native art history?
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and hello. For that question, I think that there are art history is always a multitude. I think that this is why I wanted to do the the exhibition Indian theater in the book itself was to show not only the history of performance, but performance as a praxis in which we work. Um, so there's absolutely that. But I'm also interested in the ways in which our practices and our art histories expand uh, the mainstream, like say, like the mainstream understanding of what, or mainstream art understanding of what performance art is, or institutional critique. So, one thing I put forward in the book is that uh, a work like James Luna's artifact piece is a form of institutional critique, but it's a very culturally specific one. And why is this not included in the kind of broader canon of institutional critique? Or why isn't, let's say, the work of Bo Dick considered social practice? Because it is. So I think that we necessarily need to occupy all those modes. And Robert, as you know, like Inuit art history is a very defined field and it is its own history. Absolutely. I'm also interested in the ways in which their work, and this is why I wanted to work with the work of Jesse Unark and also Osiniak here, kind of expands our understanding of whether it's performance or also with Jesse Unark, this the transformative potential of dance, actually. So yeah, I would say that we have to operate on all modes.
Amazing. Well, that concludes our Q&A portion. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question, and thank you for answering these questions. And I will hand it right back over to you, Candice, to close us out with your reading.
Yeah. Um, just because I have read, I would say, the same part of my writing before a few times, I didn't want to do that this time. I actually wanted to leave you with this credo. So I'm going to be a ventriloquist for Lloyd Kivanu. So I'm reading from page 17. So this is Lloyd Kivanu's Credo for American Indian Theater. So here we go. We believe that an exciting American Indian theater can be evolved out of the framework of Indian traditions. We think this evolution must come from the most sensitive approaches imaginable in order to not misuse or cheapen the original nature of Indian forms, most of which are closely tied to religion. We believe that young Indian people must be trained in the fullest degree regarding all aspects of theater, the history of universal forms, the technical aspects, acting, speech, and movement. And it's against this understanding that they must be then led to examine Indian culture for that which is theatrical, and then find ways to interpret these unique aspects for contemporary audiences in true theater settings. Indian theater ultimately will be born from this group of sophisticated Indian artists until their statement is made and heretofore new theatrical form is evolved. We can only view present dramatic manifestations of Indian life, the religious ceremony, the grandstand performances, the powwow, as the raw material from which Indian theater will evolve. If the last statement is acceptable, then it is of significance that Indian theater cannot be developed overnight, but will come only as the result of an educational process in which Indian artists are created who can then make their own statements. To understand this point fully, one must acknowledge the fact that no pure traditional form of Indian theater presently exists. One must be created. New ethnic cultural forms must result from the forces and ideas within the group itself. Unless significant developments are afoot, which we do not know about, we feel we are in the vanguard of American Indian theater development, to the extent that we have given considerable thought to the matter and have arrived at some theories about where Indian theater might start. Valid vehicles in the form of plays, supporting music and dance forms, actually originating from Indian students themselves, are beginning to focus. The momentum is exciting, with every indication that the potential can be realized. And that's from July 1969, written in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I think it's a nice closing and opening for this talk. So thank you, Jami, for being in dialogue. Thank you, Magli, for all your work in setting this up. And thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for this stage.
Thank you so much, Candice, and thank you, Jamie. I'd also like to thank Nikki and Amelia from Forge Projects for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd like to thank Tier Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Philip Larrett Smith and Mathilde Guidi on the event of Louise Bourgeois gathering wool on Viet Hauser and Worth. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Candice.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
Jamie.
much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you for this conversation. Thank you, Candice.
Wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Hi.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.